Hello and welcome to the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority tutorial on spot check and financial documentation. Every grantee or every organization that receives a grant from the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority is required to retain financial documentation of grant and match expenditures. So that means you need to keep that documentation as you're spending both your grant and your matching funds on the project as you go along. Now, a portion of grantees will be required to submit all of that financial documentation with their final reports, and that's what we call our spot check policy. It's similar to filing your taxes. Not everyone gets audited with the IRS, but if you do, you need to have all that backup financial documentation. And I'd like to point out on the slide in the bottom right part of the screen, you can see the pages in our MHAA grants manual in which this subject matter, financial documentation, and our spot check policy is discussed. And you'll see that on the other slides as we go through the tutorial. A couple questions we often get from our grantees is, when should I start keeping these records? Well, you want to start as soon as you start spending money on your project, either your grant funds directly or the matching funds that your organization is using, or volunteer time for that matter. And so don't wait until the end of the project to start keeping these records, whether it's staff time, volunteer time, or those basic expenditures. You want to start that at the very beginning of your project. And the second question, of course, is how long should I keep them? Well, grantees must keep all their materials related to the grant, that's both the grant and the match expenditures, for 3 years after the project completion date. And you can find that completion date in your grant agreement or in an extension letter or email if you do get that date extended. But 3 years after that date is when you need to keep those records. And you want to ensure that multiple people within your organization know where those records are. Preferably you're keeping both a paper copy and a digital copy of those records, but at least one or the other, and that multiple folks know how to get to them. So what do we mean when we say financial documentation? Well, let's get into some different categories of what that looks like. Grantees must retain documentation of expenditure, the money that you're spending as part of your grant project. And so some ways that you can show what you've spent are invoices, receipts, contracts, staff time logs, pay stubs from staff showing the rate of pay, volunteer time logs, also records of donated materials or donated services. So maybe you have an invoice that's for $0, but it's showing the value of what was contributed, and that can be part of your match as well. And these expenditures that you're keeping the documentation for, they should align with those line items that are in your approved budget in your grant agreement, or that are in your most recent amended budget if you did request a budget amendment. So every receipt that you're keeping and every invoice, you should be able to categorize it into one of those approved budget line items. So maybe you have one receipt and it's going to be going towards your line item for exhibit materials. Maybe you have another receipt that actually goes towards the line item for an exhibit opening event or creating a brochure. Whatever it is, you can categorize that as you go along, and that will help you stay organized. Also, if you are selected for spot check, rather than just retaining these records and keeping them organized in your files, you also then would need to scan and upload that documentation as part of your final report in that case. And a little bit more information about exactly what we'll be looking for when we review that financial documentation. Again, you want to have all the items that you're documenting clearly labeled so that they're matching the budget category or line item. And you can either write that label, that line item number, right on the invoice or receipt itself, or you can name that in the file name when you're uploading electronic documents, so that we can see, okay, this invoice, clearly the file name shows it's going to line item 7, for example. If volunteer time or staff time spent on the project is included in your grant budget, then you should also be keeping timesheets and pay stubs to document that time. And for each staff member, you don't need to keep every single pay stub for all the pay periods when they were working on the grant project. What you need to keep is just a sample pay stub showing their rate of pay, and then also a log or a timesheet that specifies when they were working on the grant project itself. And we are accepting printouts from QuickBooks or other accounting software that shows that staff time spent, in addition to the log that's showing specifically that they were working on the grant project. And we want to see that the documentation you send us, that it matches the individual budget line items, and that if we add up the totals for all the documentation that you sent, that we should get the amount that you put for that line item in your certification of expenses form. So for example, if you have a budget line item that is for exhibit research for consultant time, for example, and we're adding up multiple invoices for that consultant time, those multiple invoices should add up to the total that you said was spent for that line item when you fill out what's called your certification of expenses form with your final report or with your mid-project report. And we have another video as well specifically about filling out that certification of expenses form. If your project budget includes volunteer time spent on the project, then we do ask that you keep a log of volunteer hours as part of your financial documentation. That log should include who, what, when, how long. So the volunteer's name, what they were doing, how that relates to the project, if that's not clear, the date, how many hours they were spending. And you could do this in different formats. It could be individual timesheets that each of the volunteers are keeping track of and signing off on, or it could be an overall spreadsheet that you have a staff member or a lead volunteer signing off on the spreadsheet of who volunteered when. We do want someone to sign it, whether it's an individual volunteer log or that overall spreadsheet of multiple volunteer hours. And once you have the total of how much volunteer time was spent on the project, you can multiply that by the hourly rate there for Maryland. When you get ready to add that up and submit your report, you should check independentsector.org, which is our source for the value of volunteer time. As you can see, they have that listed for Maryland at $29.51 per hour for 2019. But when you go to submit your report, they have shared an updated rate for 2020. You can use that rate to calculate the value of volunteer time for your project. And I should also say that this is the standard rate for any type of volunteer hours that are spent on the project. If you're working with a volunteer who has a specialized skill set and they're providing specialized services as part of their volunteer time, so for example, an architect providing you with drawings, then they should actually give you an invoice showing their professional rate and the value of their time rather than using this standard rate. And here's an example of a volunteer form that would allow a volunteer to record their hours and their mileage spent on the project. This is available on our website, as you can see from the link there. You can download it and use it if you'd like. You're not required to use this specific form. It's just a resource if you would like to use it that gives an example of the type of form we're looking for. And again, either the volunteer themselves or a volunteer or project manager should be signing off on either the individual log or on the overall volunteer spreadsheet, just to confirm that these hours really were spent on the grant project. And to review, every grantee who receives a Maryland Heritage Areas Authority MHAA grant, everyone needs to retain, to keep this financial documentation that we've been discussing in this tutorial for 3 years after their project completion date. A selected number of grantees each year will actually be selected for spot check, or what we refer to as spot check, that's similar to an audit. What will happen if that's the case for you? Well, you'll be notified around the time of your project completion date, which is about 2 months before your final report is due, and you'll be notified then that you were selected for spot check. Then hopefully you have all those documents already in their folders, either physical folders or on your computer or both, and you'll have those documents ready. Because when you submit your final report, at that point you'll be scanning and uploading and submitting all of that documentation of expenditure for the grant and match costs. And if you scan and upload all that documentation and it looks like something is missing, your project monitor will work with you to identify which documents are missing, if any, and to request those missing documents from you. So you have another chance at that point to make sure that everything is included. However, if you cannot provide the documentation for the money that you spent, both your grant and your match, then you do risk having grant funds recaptured or getting a smaller final payment than you expected. So you want to make sure you're keeping all this documentation as you go along. And if you have any questions as you go through your grant project and you're gathering this financial documentation, please reach out to your project monitor. That would be either myself, Ennis Smith, Jennifer Ruffner, or Andrew Arvizu. And if you don't know who your project monitor is, that's okay. Just reach out to any one of us and we can point you in the right direction. Thank you for watching the tutorial, and good luck with all of your wonderful MHAA projects.